In the humidity of a Hong Kong summer, 1970, the laws of physics seemed to pause for 45 seconds. On the mat lay 275 pounds of American grappling muscle, unconscious, motionless, and completely undone. Standing over him was a man 100 pounds lighter, breathing as rhythmically as if he were reading a newspaper. The world expected a war of attrition. They expected a clash of styles. What they witnessed was not a fight, but a dismantling. The outcome was never in doubt. Only the severity of the lesson remained to be seen. Hong Kong, 1970. The city was a sensory wall of humidity, neon, and ambition. It was a place where the old world was being rapidly, sometimes violently, overlaid by the new. In the narrow alleys of Kowloon, traditional herbalists operated next door to aggressive Western advertising. The air was thick, not just with the heat of the South China Sea, but with a specific kind of friction. This was a time when martial arts were not yet a global franchise. They were a local currency. In the rooftop schools and basement dojos, reputation was the only bank account that mattered. If you claimed mastery, you were expected to demonstrate it. There were no points, no referees, and often no audiences other than the students who swept the floors. But the landscape was shifting. The influx of Western culture brought with it a different kind of combatant, the professional wrestler. These were men of gargantuan proportions, performers who blurred the lines between sport and spectacle. They arrived in Hong Kong not to learn, but to conquer. They brought size, they brought volume, they brought a brash, theatrical invincibility that stood in stark contrast to the stoic silence of the traditional sifu. To the local masters, these giants were a curiosity, sometimes an irritation. But to the public, they were monsters. The sheer physics of a 6'6" American grappler seemed insurmountable to a population whose martial philosophy relied on structure rather than mass. In the middle of this cultural collision stood Bruce Lee. He was not yet the global icon on a poster. He was a man returning to a home that barely recognized him, carrying a philosophy that the traditionalists called heresy. He preached efficiency over tradition. He spoke of intercepting, of fluidity, of discarding what did not work. To the old guard, he was arrogant. To the challengers from the West, he was small. 145 pounds of wire and theory. The year 1970 was the tipping point. The city was becoming a pressure cooker. Challenges were issued in newspapers and whispered in tea houses. The wrestlers mocked the dancing of the kungfu masters. The masters dismissed the brute labor of the wrestlers. It was an environment waiting for a catalyst. It required a collision to determine which truth held weight, the crushing reality of mass or the piercing reality of speed. The stage was set not in a grand arena, but in the collective consciousness of a city waiting to see if their legends could bleed. The friction was no longer theoretical. The giants were circling. They called him the Queen. The origin of the moniker has been blurred by translation and time. Some say it was a mockery of his flamboyant satin robes. Others claim it was a corruption of a surname like McQueen. But in the wrestling circuits of 1970, the name was not a punchline. It was a paradox that made the violence he inflicted even more jarring. He was 275 pounds of American corn-fed muscle. In the narrow, neon-lit streets of Hong Kong, he did not just walk. He displaced the atmosphere. He was a physical anomaly in a region where the average combatant weighed nearly half as much. He represented the Western philosophy of combat in its purest, most brutal form. Mass times acceleration equals dominance. His style was not art. It was geology. He operated on the principle that if you could not move him, you could not hurt him. He was a grappler who specialized in suffocation, trapping smaller men under the sheer tonnage of his frame until the will to fight was squeezed out of their lungs. For weeks, he had been dismantling local fighters in exhibition matches. These were not secret duels. They were public humiliations. He would stand in the center of the ring, arms wide, inviting kicks and punches that bounced off his torso like hail off a tin roof. He laughed at the forms. He mocked the stances. He openly questioned the validity of a martial art that, in his words, danced around the truth. The media, sensing blood, gave him a microphone. His rhetoric was simple and devastating. He didn't challenge a specific school. He challenged the physics of the Chinese martial arts identity. "There is no magic," he told a reporter. "There is only weight." He created a narrative of inevitability. To the public, he appeared as an immovable object. The local masters, bound by tradition and dignity, hesitated to engage with a man who treated combat as a carnival act. They saw him as uncivilized. He saw them as obsolete. But the silence from the traditional schools was misinterpreted by the American as fear. His challenges grew louder. He began to demand a real opponent, someone who could prove that the ancient ways were more than just theater. He wasn't looking for a match. He was looking to break the spirit of the city. He wanted the biggest name. He wanted the man who was bridging the gap between East and West. He didn't realize that by demanding the best, he was inviting a storm that operated on a frequency he couldn't see. He was preparing for a contest of strength, unaware that the man coming for him had no intention of playing that game. The challenge was issued. The city held its breath. The immovable object had finally called out the irresistible force. While the American wrestler filled the newspapers with noise, Bruce Lee filled the room with silence. This is the part of the story that history often glosses over in favor of the action. But to understand the violence that followed, one must understand the stillness that preceded it. The media circus was in full rotation. Reporters camped outside the Golden Harvest studios, hungry for a quote, a reaction, a burst of anger that would match the wrestler's vitriol. They wanted the dragon to roar back. Instead, they got nothing. Inside the private training halls, the atmosphere was not one of panic or frantic preparation. There were no montage sequences of heavy bag work or desperate strategy sessions. Witnesses from that week describe a mood that was almost clinically detached. Lee was not ignoring the threat. He was observing it, processing it, deconstructing it. One close associate later recalled sitting with Lee as the radio played an interview with the Queen. The wrestler was detailing exactly how he would snap the smaller man's spine. Lee did not turn the radio off. He did not frown. He continued to drink his tea, his head slightly cocked, listening to the cadence of the threat. He was listening for gaps. He was listening for ego. To the uninitiated, this lack of visible emotion looked like hesitation. The rumor mill began to churn. Perhaps the gap in weight was too much. Perhaps the film star was afraid to risk his reputation against a reality he couldn't script. But those inside the room knew better. They recognized this specific frequency of calm. It was the calm of a predator that has already calculated the outcome of the hunt. Lee's philosophy, Jeet Kune Do, was built on the elimination of the unessential. Worry was unessential. Anger was unessential. Performance was unessential. The decision to accept the challenge was not made at a press conference with flashing bulbs. It happened in a hallway, almost in passing. A promoter brought the final terms. A closed-door confrontation, witnesses allowed, but no cameras, no judges, and no time limit. Lee didn't look at the paper. He didn't ask about the rules because in a real fight there are no rules. He simply adjusted his glasses, looked at the promoter, and nodded once. "Tell him 3 p.m., he said. There was no bluster, no prediction of pain, just the administrative setting of an appointment. It was the terrifying banality of true confidence. The noise of the city stopped at the door of the dojo. Inside, the decision was made. The variable of if had been removed. Now there was only when. The room was utilitarian. No ropes, no canvas, just the hard reality of a polished wooden floor and the smell of sweat and dust. There were perhaps 20 people present, trainers, stuntmen, a few nervous executives. They pressed their backs against the walls, instinctively creating a perimeter. When the two men stepped into the center, the visual disparity was almost comical. The American, stripping off his robe, seemed to occupy 2 distinct time zones. He was a wall of pale muscle, 275 pounds of leverage, shifting his weight from foot to foot, the floorboards groaning under the load. Opposite him, Bruce Lee stood in a pair of simple trousers and a tank top. He did not bounce. He did not shake his limbs out. He stood with his hands loosely at his sides, his breathing undetectable. He looked less like a fighter and more like a man waiting for a bus. There was no referee to drop a hand. There was no bell. There was simply a moment where the air pressure in the room seemed to drop, and the American decided it was time. The wrestler lunged. It was a professional move, a wide, encroaching grasp designed to close the distance and smother the smaller man. He moved with the confidence of someone who had never met a force that could arrest his momentum. He was wrong. Witnesses recount that Lee did not retreat. He did not sidestep to circle. He moved into the space the wrestler had just vacated. It was the principle of interception brought to terrifying life. Before the American's hands could find a grip, Lee had already bridged the gap. The first impact was a side kick, delivered not to the head, but to the lead knee. It was a low, sickening thud that buckled the giant's structural integrity instantly. The mountain didn't crumble, it tipped. As the wrestler's posture broke forward, reflexively reaching down to the injury, Lee was already airborne. It wasn't the cinematic, high-flying wirework of the movies. It was a tight, compact explosion of kinetic energy. A strike to the face, followed by a sweep that exploited the wrestler's compromised balance. 275 pounds hit the floor. The sound was like a car door slamming in a cathedral. The wrestler scrambled, relying on instinct, trying to use his size to roll and crush. But Lee was no longer in front of him. He was a ghost, fluidly transitioning to the wrestler's back, applying a choke that had nothing to do with strength and everything to do with geometry. The struggle lasted seconds. The thrashing of the giant slowed, then ceased. The room went silent. Lee stood up, adjusted his shirt, and stepped back. He wasn't winded. He wasn't sweating. He looked down at the unconscious form of the man who had promised to break him. The entire exchange had taken less than a minute. The violence was absolute, but it was the efficiency that terrified the room. It was not a fight. It was a correction. When the American wrestler regained consciousness, the first thing he felt was not pain, but confusion. He lay flat on the wooden boards, staring at the ceiling of a room that had been his hunting ground only minutes before. The physical damage was specific, a bruised knee, a sore throat, but the psychological damage was total. To the observers in the room, the event had been a blur. To the martial artist, it was a lecture in physics. The collapse of the giant was not an accident. It was the inevitable result of a flawed assumption. The wrestler had entered the circle believing that mass was the ultimate trump card. He operated on the idea that for Bruce Lee to win, Lee would have to overpower him. He expected a contest of strength, a friction of bodies, where the heavier object would naturally displace the lighter one. Lee refused the premise of the question. He did not fight the man. He fought the man's structure. By targeting the lead knee, Lee did not attempt to move 275 pounds. He simply removed the pillar that held it up. It was the difference between trying to push a building over and simply removing the cornerstone. The gravity that the wrestler relied on to crush his opponents was suddenly turned against him. He became a victim of his own weight. This was the silent demonstration Lee had always spoken of, but rarely showed with such finality. It was the physical manifestation of Wu Wei, effortless action. There was no wasted movement, no emotional expenditure, no theatrical wind-up. For the wrestler, the defeat was existential. He hadn't just lost a fight. He had lost his understanding of how the world worked. A lifetime of training, of building armor, of intimidating smaller men, had been rendered obsolete in 45 seconds. He realized, perhaps for the first time, that he was not a predator. He was simply a target, large and slow. The room remained quiet as he was helped to his feet. There was no cheering. The witnesses understood that cheering would be inappropriate, like clapping at a funeral or a surgery. They had seen something that disturbed the comfortable order of things. Lee offered no handshake, not out of malice, but out of a refusal to validate the spectacle. He had made his point. The lesson was not that the small can beat the big. The lesson was that big and small are illusions when speed and precision are absolute. The anatomy of the collapse proved that a giant is only a giant as long as he can stand. Decades have passed since that humid afternoon in Kowloon. The dojo is gone, replaced by high-rise apartments. The witnesses have aged, their memories softening into the haze of nostalgia. Bruce Lee has been immortalized in bronze and celluloid, a global deity of action cinema. But the story of the wrestler remains a ghost. It does not appear in the official biographies. There is no grainy 8mm footage to upload to the Internet. It exists only in the oral history of the few who were there, and in the quiet confession of the man who lost. Years later, far removed from the neon lights of Hong Kong, the wrestler, no longer the Queen, but an older, heavier man with bad knees, would speak of the incident. He did not speak with bitterness. He spoke with the hushed reverence of a man who had survived a natural disaster. "He didn't fight me," the wrestler told a journalist in a smoky bar in Chicago. "He solved me." The wrestler recounted how he had spent years believing that combat was an addition of force. He believed that if he added more weight, more muscle, more aggression, he became more dangerous. In 45 seconds, Lee had taught him the crushing reality of subtraction. The incident didn't destroy the wrestler's career, but it ended his arrogance. He returned to the States, not as a conqueror, but as a student. He began to study the mechanics of leverage. He told the younger giants in the locker rooms that size was a lie if it wasn't tethered to a center. He became a whisperer of a truth he had learned the hard way. This is the true legacy of that day. It wasn't about the victory. Winning a street fight proves nothing but dominance. The legacy was the shift in consciousness. That silent room in Hong Kong became ground zero for a realization that would eventually permeate the entire world of martial arts, that a human body is not a statue to be admired, but a problem to be solved. Bruce Lee walked out of that room and never spoke of it publicly. He didn't need the applause. He didn't need the headline. He knew that the lesson had been planted. Today we look at the statues of the dragon and see the flexed muscles, the nunchucks, the war cry. We see the movie star. But the truth of his mastery wasn't in what he showed the camera. It was in what he showed a 275-pound stranger in a quiet room when the world wasn't watching. It was the mastery of silence, the mastery of the intercept, the mastery of the moment where the immovable object meets the water and simply floats away. Subscribe to the channel to enjoy more interesting stories like the video. And don't forget to press the bell icon so you can receive updates about our upcoming new videos first. Thank you.